The first thing that reached him was not the sight of the village, but its breath. It drifted down the holler in slow, invisible waves, thick enough to taste, a sweetness gone wrong, like meat left too long in summer shade. The horses refused to go farther. They stamped and snorted, eyes rolling white, until he dismounted and walked alone, boots sinking into a road softened by years of damp neglect. Even the insects were quiet. No cicadas, no flies, only the low creak of trees bending inward as if listening. The village sat cupped between the mountains, cabins slouched like tired men, roofs sagging beneath moss and memory. Smoke rose from chimneys, but it carried no warmth, only that same cloying rot, as if whatever burned inside those homes was already spoiled. He noticed then that no one stood outside. Curtains twitched. Doors remained shut. It was a place awake but pretending to sleep. When the first villager finally appeared, she did not greet him. She only stared, her face drawn tight, skin pale and waxed, eyes glassy as cured meat. Up close, the smell deepened. It came not from the land or the air but from her, seeping through her pores in faint, damp pulses. He realized with a jolt that the scent changed with her breathing, stronger on the exhale, as though something inside her was breaking down, slowly, patiently. He asked for water. She pointed toward the well without speaking. As he passed, he saw dark stains along her sleeves, irregular and spreading, like bruises that had learned to crawl. The well water was cold and clear, but when he lifted the bucket, a thin film clung to the surface, shimmering faintly, pink and grey. He did not drink. Church bells rang then, sudden and sharp, and every door in the village opened at once. People stepped out together, men, women, children, all moving with the same careful stiffness, their faces slack with shared restraint. They walked toward the church in silence, shoes scraping dirt, each step releasing another breath of decay into the air. As they passed him, he understood the truth settling heavy in his chest. This village did not smell of death because people were dying here. It smelled this way because something had died long ago and was still being kept alive inside them. The surveyor reached the edge of the Appalachian village just as the light began to thin, the sun pressing low against the ridgeline as though reluctant to look any longer. He had traveled through mining towns, flood-ruined settlements, and hollers forgotten by maps, yet nothing prepared him for the way the air itself warned him before the land did. The smell came first, rolling down from the trees in slow, oppressive layers, thick enough to settle in his throat. It was not the sharp sting of rot he expected, but something sweeter, heavier, like decay that had learned patience. Each breath felt borrowed, as though the air did not belong to the living anymore. His horses stopped without command, hooves grinding into the dirt as they refused the final stretch of road. He tried coaxing them forward, but their bodies trembled, nostrils flaring, eyes wild with an animal certainty he did not share yet. When he dismounted, the smell deepened instantly, no longer distant but intimate, clinging to his clothes, threading itself through his hair. The forest around the road seemed wrong in subtle ways. Leaves hung limp despite the breeze. Birds watched without sound. Even the insects, normally relentless at this hour, were absent, as if the land itself was holding its breath. As he walked, the village revealed itself slowly, cabins emerging between trees like shapes remembered from a bad dream. Roofs sagged under the weight of years and dampness, and walls bore dark streaks where rainwater had dragged something unseen downward. Smoke rose from chimneys, but it carried no comfort, only more of that same suffocating scent, now unmistakably human. He realized then that the smell was layered, old and new at once, like generations of decay stacked atop each other without ever being cleared away. He called out, announcing himself, his voice sounding small and unwelcome in the open space. No answer came, though he felt watched from every direction. Curtains shifted. Floorboards creaked behind closed doors. The village was not abandoned, it was hiding. The deeper he walked, the stronger the sensation grew that he had crossed into a place that did not want witnesses. His boots sank slightly into the road, the dirt soft and dark, almost greasy beneath the surface, releasing brief, sharper bursts of odor with each step. By the time he reached the center of the village, his eyes watered and his stomach tightened, instinctively rejecting the air. He understood then that this was not the smell of something dead lying forgotten, but of something long buried that had never stopped breaking down, steadily seeping upward, marking the land and everyone bound to it. When the villagers finally acknowledged the surveyor's presence, they did so with a politeness that felt rehearsed, like words spoken often enough to lose their meaning. They gathered at a careful distance, never close enough for him to read their faces fully, never far enough to pretend they were not involved. When he asked about the smell, their answers came quickly, overlapping, each one echoing the same explanation. They said the mountains trapped damp air, that rot settled in the hollows during certain seasons, that old wells and shallow graves from hard winters sometimes breathed back up through the soil. Their voices carried a practiced calm, the tone of people who had repeated the lie so often it no longer needed thought. Yet their bodies betrayed them. Hands stayed clenched, knuckles pale beneath skin stretched too tight. Eyes flicked toward the ground whenever the smell thickened, as if afraid to meet whatever might be looking back from below. One man laughed too loudly, the sound brittle and hollow, and the others fell silent at once, staring him down until he swallowed the noise and lowered his head. Fear moved among them like a current, unseen but undeniable, binding them closer than honesty ever could. The surveyor noticed how carefully they avoided certain words. No one said death. No one said blood. Even the word sin was spoken only once, quickly corrected to misfortune, then to weather, then to nothing at all. They spoke in circles, stories folding in on themselves, explanations that never quite touched the truth they were skirting. The smell, they insisted, had always been there, just part of life in the hills. But their oldest residents could not agree on when it began, and the youngest refused to speak entirely, their faces tight with a dread they had learned before language. As they talked, the wind shifted, carrying a stronger wave of decay through the group. Several villagers flinched. One woman pressed a hand to her mouth, breathing shallowly through her nose, eyes glistening with unshed tears. Another crossed himself, though he stopped halfway, as if remembering too late that faith had rules here. The surveyor realized then that this was not ignorance but survival. The villagers were not confused about the smell, they were terrified of acknowledging it too clearly. Every answer they gave felt less like information and more like a warning. The message beneath their words was simple and urgent: do not dig, do not ask, do not name what you sense. They watched him closely as he listened, measuring his reactions, waiting to see whether he would accept their explanation or push beyond it. In that moment, standing among people who feared their own air, the surveyor understood that whatever poisoned this village was not merely buried in the ground but lodged deep within its people, sustained by denial and sharpened by the constant, suffocating effort of pretending nothing was wrong. The first animal was discovered just after dawn, a mule belonging to one of the outer cabins, found standing in its pen as if waiting to be fed. From a distance it looked unharmed, its hide smooth, ribs full, eyes open and alert. It even shifted its weight when approached, breath fogging faintly in the cold air. But the smell around it was unbearable, far stronger than anywhere else in the village, thick enough to make grown men gag. When the owner touched its flank, the flesh yielded like soaked cloth, sinking beneath his fingers before slowly rising again, warm and alive. Word spread quickly, though no one raised their voice. Villagers gathered in a loose ring, keeping their distance, faces grey and tight. The mule took a step forward and part of its hind leg split open with a soft, wet sound. There was no blood, only a dark, pulpy mass that sloughed downward, exposing tissue already breaking apart. Still, the animal did not cry out. Its chest rose and fell steadily, eyes dull but conscious, as if whatever was happening to its body had not yet reached its awareness. By midday, more animals were found the same way. Chickens with feathers intact but bodies hollowing beneath the skin, pigs whose bellies sagged unnaturally low, flesh thinning and separating as though dissolved from the inside. When one hog collapsed, its body folded inward rather than breaking open, the structure beneath already gone. The smell intensified with each discovery, rolling through the village in waves, clinging to clothes and hair, soaking into wood and earth. The surveyor watched as the villagers worked with grim efficiency. No one prayed. No one asked why. They did not slaughter the animals or put them down. Instead, they dug shallow pits and lowered the living bodies inside, covering them quickly with dirt while the creatures still breathed beneath the soil. A low vibration rose from the ground afterward, faint but unmistakable, like movement continuing below the surface. When he asked why they did not end the animals' suffering, an older man shook his head, eyes fixed on the dirt. "Killing them," he said, "only made it worse." That night, the sounds began. Soft shifting beneath the earth, slow and wet, accompanied by a smell so strong it seeped through closed doors and settled into lungs and dreams. The surveyor lay awake, understanding dawning with sick clarity. This was not disease as he knew it, not rot caused by age or injury. Something here was consuming life from the inside, preserving breath and warmth while dismantling everything that gave form and purpose. The animals were not dying first and then decaying. They were decaying as a condition of remaining alive, their bodies serving as proof that in this village, even survival came at the cost of becoming something unrecognizable. The church stood at the highest rise of the village, its white paint long ago yellowed by damp air and smoke, its steeple leaning slightly as if exhausted by the weight of what it oversaw. On the surveyor's second morning, the bell rang not to call people in, but to warn them away. A hand-painted sign hung across the doors, the words uneven and freshly darkened, announcing that confession was suspended until further notice. No reason was given, though none seemed necessary to those who read it. The villagers passed beneath the bell with lowered heads, crossing the road to avoid the steps entirely. When he asked the preacher about it, the man's face tightened in a way that suggested pain more than anger. He spoke quietly, glancing toward the open windows as if afraid sound might travel farther than it should. Confession, he said, had become dangerous. Not spiritually, but physically. It began with small things, sins barely worth naming, a theft of grain, a lie told to a neighbor. The moment the words left the mouth, the smell would surge, thick and immediate, filling the church so completely it drove people to their knees. Some fainted. Others retched until their throats bled. Then came the changes. One woman confessed to adultery and collapsed before she reached the altar, her skin darkening in spreading patches, as if bruises were blooming from within. A man admitted to striking his son in anger, and by evening his hands were blistered and soft, the flesh beneath sloughing away in pale strips. The preacher said he could see it happening as they spoke, a subtle loosening, a sag in the face or neck, as though the body itself were reacting to the truth being exposed. At first, they believed it was punishment, a direct and terrible judgment. They tried fasting, prayer, longer services, silence broken only by hymns sung through clenched teeth. But the more they acknowledged their sins, the worse the affliction became. The smell grew stronger, more concentrated, lingering longest around those who spoke honestly. Eventually, confession became an act of self-destruction. People learned to swallow their words, to hold guilt inside where it could not immediately take shape. The preacher locked the confessional after a boy confessed to hating his father and was found the next morning with his chest caved inward, organs collapsed into a blackened slurry while his heart continued to beat weakly beneath the ribs. After that, no one argued. Faith remained, but it was reshaped into something fearful and careful, stripped of absolution. Sin, they decided, was safer left unnamed. Spoken aloud, it took root, attaching itself to flesh and bone, demanding proof. The church still opened on Sundays, but sermons were hollow, prayers vague and cautious, circling meaning without touching it, because in this village, truth no longer lived in the soul alone, and every honest word risked becoming a physical wound that could not be healed. The children were the proof the villagers could not explain away, no matter how carefully they chose their words. They were born quietly, without the usual cries that filled a room with relief and fear all at once. Midwives learned to expect the silence, to hold their breath as they lifted each newborn into the dim light. At first glance the babies looked healthy, skin pink and warm, fingers curling with instinctive strength. It was only when they were cleaned that the marks appeared, darkened impressions pressed into their flesh like memories that had left fingerprints behind. The bruises varied in size and shape, some long and narrow, others rounded and deep, always placed where no hand should have been. Around tiny wrists. Along ribs still soft with cartilage. Sometimes at the throat. They were not the mottled colors of injury but a uniform, purplish gray, as though pressure had been applied evenly and deliberately. When touched, the marks did not cause pain. The infant slept through it, breathing steadily, unaware of the dread tightening the room around them. Mothers asked what had gone wrong during labor, whether the birth had been too hard, whether the child had been turned the wrong way. The midwives had learned not to answer. They wrapped the babies quickly and handed them over, eyes averted, faces pale. By the next morning, the bruises would begin to fade, leaving behind faint shadows that lingered for weeks, sometimes months, before finally disappearing. But their presence at birth was enough. Everyone understood what they implied. The surveyor noticed how adults interacted with the children. Touch was hesitant, careful, as if afraid of adding new marks to bodies already claimed. Lullabies were sung softly, words chosen with painful precision, avoiding promises or declarations of hope. Parents watched their children closely, not for illness or weakness, but for signs of remembering something they should not know. A few swore they saw infants tracking movement in empty rooms, eyes following shapes no one else could see. Whispers spread that the children carried the village's weight, that whatever had been buried and denied had found another way to surface. Some believed the bruises were the hands of the dead, passing judgment before a child could speak. Others thought they were warnings, reminders that sin did not end with those who committed it. The most frightening belief was spoken only once, late at night, before being swallowed by silence, that the children were being prepared, marked early for something that would be asked of them later. As the years passed, those born with the bruises grew normally, but none of them ever left. Attempts to send children away ended in sickness, flesh softening and darkening within days of crossing the valley's edge, forcing their return. The village learned then that the marks were not wounds but bonds, proof that from the moment of birth, the next generation already belonged to whatever lingered beneath the soil, waiting patiently for them to grow into its inheritance. The dried creek bed lay beyond the last row of cabins, a shallow scar cutting through stone and clay where water had not run in years. Children were forbidden to go near it, though no one ever said why. When the surveyor followed the bed one afternoon, he noticed how the smell intensified with each step, no longer drifting but rising directly from the ground, warm and heavy as breath. The earth there was darker, packed down unnaturally smooth, as if pressed by countless hands over a long period of time. It was a broken shovel that revealed the truth. A villager digging to divert rainwater struck something that did not sound like rock or root. The crack echoed hollow and wrong. When the dirt was pulled back, cloth appeared, grey and brittle, woven in a style too deliberate to be debris. More hands joined in, movements stiff and resigned, uncovering limbs folded inward, bones arranged with an unsettling care. There was no panic. No screams. Only a shared, exhausted stillness as the ground gave up what it had been holding. The bodies lay close together, far more than the space should have allowed, layered carefully, each placed facing upward. Arms were crossed over chests. Hands clasped. Skulls tilted as if gazing toward a sky they could no longer see. There were men and women, elders and youths, some so small they could only have been children. No coffin remnants remained, only scraps of rotted wood and rusted nails pressed deep into the clay. The smell surged violently once the grave was opened, a concentrated wave that dropped several villagers to their knees. What unsettled the surveyor most was the absence of injury. There were no broken bones, no marks of violence, no signs of struggle. Death had come gently, or willingly. One woman's jaw was still slightly open, teeth exposed in what might have been the beginning of a prayer. The arrangement suggested ceremony, not haste, a collective decision carried out with reverence and terrible calm. As the pit widened, symbols emerged carved into flat stones at the base, their edges worn smooth by time and moisture. They resembled church markings but twisted, altered just enough to feel wrong, as if faith itself had been bent under pressure. The villagers avoided looking at them directly. One man covered his eyes and began to rock, whispering apologies to no one in particular. The surveyor understood then why the creek had dried. Water avoided this place because the ground was already full. These were not forgotten dead. They were anchors, planted deliberately beneath the village to hold something in place. The smell was not decay escaping but devotion persisting, the slow breathing of a mass grave still performing its purpose, binding the living to an ancient promise made in desperation and sealed with flesh, a promise the land itself now refused to let them break. After the grave was uncovered, the village's careful silence began to fracture, not into confession, but into fragments of memory that slipped out when people thought they were alone. The surveyor heard it in half-finished sentences, in arguments cut short, in dreams spoken aloud by those who believed no one was listening. Slowly, a shape emerged, not as a single story but as overlapping recollections that all pointed to the same night, the moment when the smell first took hold of the valley. It had been a winter night, colder than any before it, when the river froze solid and livestock starved despite full barns. Something moved in the hills then, not seen but felt, a pressure that settled over the village and pressed into their thoughts. People spoke of hearing footsteps outside their homes that left no tracks, of prayers answered too quickly and at terrible cost. Hunger and fear sharpened every choice, turning survival into a moral edge too narrow to stand on for long. On that night, the villagers gathered, not in the church but at the creek bed, carrying lanterns shielded against the wind. They believed the land demanded something in return for mercy. What that belief was rooted in no one could say anymore, only that it felt older than scripture, older than the village itself. Words were spoken, promises made, all of them vague enough to be agreed upon, specific enough to bind them together. The crime that followed was not chaotic. It was organized, communal, shared so completely that no single person could carry it alone. They chose who would lie down. Some volunteered. Others were offered up by families who believed sacrifice was love in its most desperate form. The villagers told themselves it was necessary, that it would end the hunger, calm the hills, protect the children. When it was done, the ground was smoothed and marked, the creek diverted, the promise sealed with prayer and dirt. The smell began the next morning, faint at first, like damp soil after thaw. Instead of fading, it deepened, grew layered, complex, alive. Crops improved. Animals stopped dying of cold. The village survived. But the cost lingered, seeping into everything. The truth of what they had done could not be spoken without consequence, because the act itself had been designed to be shared and unacknowledged. To name it would unravel the binding that kept the land calm. The surveyor realized then that the crime was not murder in the way the law would define it. It was a covenant built on denial. Each villager carried a portion of it, fragmented and incomplete, reinforced every day by silence. The smell was the only thing that remembered fully, the physical residue of a sin too large to be held by any one body. As long as it remained unspoken, the village endured. The moment the truth was faced as a whole, whatever they had fed beneath the creek would no longer be satisfied with memory alone. After the surveyor had spent days wandering the village, the land itself began to reveal its unnatural condition. At first, the changes were subtle, barely noticeable to anyone who did not look closely. Tree roots pressed up through the soil in tight, knotted coils, darker and glossier than normal, veins visible beneath the bark like the pulse of something living beneath the surface. Moss clung to these roots in patterns that mimicked sinew, and when the surveyor pressed his hand against the wood, the texture seemed soft and almost yielding, as if it might tear like flesh. Stones along the creek bed bore faint impressions that resembled small organs, not fully formed but unmistakably human in shape and coloration, the colors of old bruises and dried blood. The villagers spoke little of it, though their glances betrayed fear and familiarity. Children were not allowed near certain hollows, and even the elders seemed to tread carefully, eyes lowered, as though walking on the thin membrane separating the natural from the unnatural. In gardens, plants grew with curious irregularities, roots spiraled tightly around one another in impossible knots, bulbs split into halves that resembled halves of a human head, veins running through the stems in streaks of red and gray. Livestock avoided certain patches of grass, sniffing and snorting at soil that seemed to thrum beneath their hooves. The air here carried a subtle warmth, as if life and decay were overlapping, impossible to separate. One afternoon, the surveyor knelt to examine a small mound of earth that had risen without reason. When he brushed away the loose soil, he found tiny growths resembling organs pressed into the clay, delicate but fully formed in miniature, soft to the touch, pink and gray, and still pulsing faintly under his fingers. He pulled back hastily, nearly vomiting, but unable to look away. The village, he realized, had become a nursery of decay, a place where sin and secrecy had taken root so thoroughly that even the earth mirrored it. Trees, soil, plants all carried traces of the acts buried beneath them, as though the land itself remembered and reproduced the village's guilt in physical form. Even the wells and streams were affected. Water drawn from them sometimes held threads of this growth, tiny filaments that seemed to move against the current. When villagers drank, they did so carefully, often muttering prayers, not for health or sustenance, but for protection from the land itself. The surveyor began to understand that the village was no longer merely a collection of people, it had become an organism, a living extension of the original crime, feeding on silence, guilt, and flesh, and reproducing the memory of that night through everything that grew, pulsed, or lived within its boundaries. Each step he took left him with the undeniable sense that the land was watching, shaping itself to contain what had been unleashed long ago, ensuring that nothing could leave untouched or unchanged. It began with small lies, almost imperceptible, whispered in moments of fear or convenience, yet each one left its mark. Villagers discovered that dishonesty was no longer an abstract moral failing, it became a tangible, physical punishment. When someone denied a truth, whether an accusation, a misdeed, or even a fleeting thought voiced aloud, their flesh began to betray them. At first, it was subtle, a faint discoloration beneath the skin, a softening in a fingertip or around the elbow. But over hours and days, these signs escalated, spreading outward with relentless precision, the body reacting as if the lie were a corrosive agent feeding on its own warmth. The surveyor watched in horror as one man, caught in a petty argument over missing grain, began to shriek silently, his skin separating in long strips that hung loosely yet stayed attached, glistening with a damp sheen. When he tried to cover himself, the flesh tore in new places, faster than he could react. Villagers formed a tight circle around him, eyes lowered, murmuring prayers that offered no relief, their silence part of the ritual, a tacit acknowledgement that to intervene would only invite the same fate upon oneself. The man's breaths came in shallow bursts, yet his heart continued to beat, undeterred by the unraveling of the body it sustained. Children learned to observe, absorbing the rules without explanation. They understood, instinctively, that a false word could result in the same slow decay. Parents whispered warnings, never threats but statements of fact, do not lie. Not here. And the children obeyed, careful with every word, the knowledge of what awaited them lurking behind every smile or denial. Even the smallest fabrication, claiming to have seen something one had not, excusing tardiness, denying hunger, risked the flesh itself. It was no longer a moral failing but a biological certainty, an unbroken law enforced by the very bodies of the villagers. The surveyor noticed the pattern extend beyond the living. Some corpses, dug up from shallow graves for practical purposes, bore marks similar to those developing in the living, as if their bodies, even in death, responded to the truths they had withheld. This revelation deepened the unease in the village, making every glance and every word an exercise in calculation and fear. Honesty became survival, but even honesty was dangerous if it was too complete, too revealing, for the collective memory of the village demanded that some things remain unspoken. By the end of his first week, the surveyor understood that lying here was more than a crime, it was a slow execution administered by the body itself. Flesh betrayed the soul with exacting cruelty, and every villager, knowingly or not, participated in this quiet terror. The village had perfected a system in which deceit could not hide, could not escape, and could not be endured. Truth, spoken or withheld, shaped the very structure of life and decay, leaving no corner untouched, no secret safe, and no person free from the relentless, intimate judgment of their own skin. The surveyor began to understand the village in a way that went beyond smell, sight, or even fear. It was not merely a place where decay had taken root, or where bodies and land mirrored guilt, it was a living mechanism, carefully sustained by the villagers' silence. The rot, the bruises on children, the flesh-eating punishments for lies, the unnatural growths in the soil, and the carefully buried bodies all existed in a balance that demanded absolute secrecy. Nothing could leave the village without carrying the stain of its history, and nothing could remain honest without paying a toll in flesh or breath. The truth itself was the currency of survival, and everyone in the valley was a debtor. Visitors like him were tolerated only because their presence tested the system without breaking it. Curiosity was dangerous, questions had consequences. The villagers' constant evasions were not fear of discovery alone, but an understanding that acknowledging the full reality would unravel the fragile equilibrium that kept them alive. Every glance, every movement, every whispered story, even the tiniest slip of honesty, was a risk of unleashing the weight of the original sin, which was not merely an event but a persistent, breathing force embedded in the soil, in the buildings, and in the very bodies of the people. They had fed it, nurtured it, and it had grown beyond their comprehension or control, yet they remained bound to it through obedience and denial. The surveyor realized that the village's macabre ecosystem had its own logic. Death had become a tool, decay a signal, and the land itself an accomplice. The crime buried beneath the creek bed was only the beginning. What had been committed was not a single act but a contract with the valley, a covenant that transformed every life, every body, and every act of speech into part of a larger, ongoing ritual. The villagers' avoidance of confession, their careful observation of truth, the living punishments that accompanied deception, all of these were methods of sustaining what the village had created. Sin, unspoken and persistent, had become a material substance, a force that demanded fuel in the form of flesh, breath, and secrecy. He understood then why the smell would never leave, why the children bore marks at birth, why lies became physical wounds, and why the soil itself seemed to pulse with human memory. The village was preserving death, cultivating it, feeding it with silence, and in doing so, ensuring that it remained powerful and present. Escape was impossible, not because the mountains trapped anyone physically, but because the living and the land were inseparable, intertwined by actions and secrets that could not be undone. Every resident was both prisoner and caretaker, sustaining a horror that could not be acknowledged, not even to themselves, without triggering the wrath of the system they had long ago agreed to maintain, whether consciously or through generations of inherited fear and obedience.